Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today we're going to be discussing a tool for reverse engineering Western Straw Hegemony. As I've mentioned in my prior videos, though there wasn't a face reveal, I will be discussing and going deeper into two models that we use to reverse engineer Western Straw Hegemony, that being the P.A.N.I.C and the E.Q.U.A.T model. So let's get going. Today we'll be explaining the P.A.N.I.C model, and we'll leave the E.Q.U.A.T model for another time, though I will have the E.Q.U.A.T model here just in case this board. Well, that shouldn't be small. Alright. And we're gonna have, I apologize if anyone's has tried to type on a board before. You know how difficult it is. Like, honestly, shout out to any teacher out there. This alone is a skill, to be honest, just writing on boards. So we have the P.A.N.I.C model and the E.Q.U.A.T model. And we're going to be explaining more into detail why there are two models, and it's not just like one big model, it's two separate models that work in tandem with each other. So before we get started with that though, let's establish something, a few key rules. One of those key rules is how the world around us is perceived, as well as how it is, essentially. So it might not come as a surprise to any Muslim out there. We know that the world was created as an earth was created in 6 days, I believe, and that in general, when you look at Allah's creations and you look at the world around us, things exist on a, and I know this word might tip off a lot of people, on a spectrum, which is to say things exist within somewhat of a gradient, really. So, you know, it's not like key points or nodes around, it's more so a gradual event or a gradual process, a natural flow, if you will. And so this is very important to understand, that our perception is based on that. Our creation, how long it takes to give birth to a child, right, is gradual, right? When Allah explains how humans were created, or how the heavens and the earth were created, it's also done so in a process, in a gradual process. It's not just like that. And subhanAllah, it would also be just like that, you know. So we need to understand that very well, that from our perspective, things are on a gradient, because everything from these two models applies to that. Now, this isn't to say that some things happen suddenly, of course, it's a part of the gradient. But usually notice how there's always a build-up before that, so it's still happening gradually. Maybe we just don't perceive that it's happening gradually. And so, with that established, now we can speak about the mechanisms of function, the mechanism itself of Western straw hegemony. I apologize, I'm going to be littering the board with, I'm going to be littering the board with acronyms. I apologize to anybody that doesn't like acronyms. Well, I don't have to. We already talked about what we have going on. So, the mechanism of function of these two models, before we delve into actually what they are, is going to be a tool, a channel, and a manifestation of those tools and channels happening in real life. So the tool in this case, so the tools that these two models leverage would be fear. Well, not just fear, but for simplicity's sake, we're going to say fear. But it's also fear, ignorance, anything that pertains to ignorance, so pride, so on and so forth, stubbornness, anything really that you can think of that's neurotic, which is actually the goal of these two models functioning on our psychology or on ourselves, is to make you internalize a neurotic process of viewing the world around you. That's what Western Straw Hegemony, that hence the name, is based on. It's based on making you think everything else is below, because it can't go up to the level that it deems itself as, so it's going to lower everything else. How it does that is going to be these two models overacting on you as the individual, which we'll detail more, and on the spectrum. So that's the tool. The channel would be your nature, your fitra, and your nurture. Your nature and your nurture. Now, how is it going to leverage those two things? We're going to go into detail, but think, for example, the first letter, polarization. It's of our nature that we automatically categorize people somewhat into profiles and tribal mindsets. This isn't necessarily negative as the West wants you to believe in. Whether it's a tribe or a country or a society or a community, it's really just different names to the same, amalgamation of people. That's really all there is to it. But the way you approach that in itself differs. The West doesn't want you to think that it differs. It just wants you to think, it wants to leverage it to make you think this versus that, instead of cooperation. If left to your own consensus, left to your own nature, you'll actually lean towards symbiosis, towards cooperation. So with that established, the tool, channel, we already spoke about the goal. Manifestation is in multimedia, books, politics, economics, psychology, and we're going to be specifically talking about those three things: economics, politics, and psychology. We're going to be giving examples on these two models being used on each of them. I'm going to try to keep it the same example so that we can break it down further. But let's get started with the actual model. Finally, now that we've established the mechanism of control. So, this is your environment. It exists on a spectrum. This is something we've established. Let's go environment. Let's just write that there. And here is you. A person, personnel, And once again, here is your environment. These two models, the reason there's two is because one of them operates on strategical prowess, strategical supremacy, if you will, and that is the P.A.N.I.C model. I forgot how to write strategy, forgive me. And I think that's up. Strategy, and this pertains to ethics. One model operates on strategy, the other model operates on ethics. Why? Well, as we mentioned, this is you, and this is your environment. Let's put an E here for environment. The way it works, the E.Q.U.A.T model works on your perception of ethics, which is supposed to be something innate to you. This is, again, back to the actual, when we spoke about the channel that these target, that's an inner channel, that's your fitra, that's your nature. The E.Q.U.A.T model targets your nature, right? So let's just write it right here, right? And the P.A.N.I.C model targets your environment. And we'll explain how right now. So this creates this form of intellectual clamp on you. So you got nowhere to go. If you internalize things, you've got this going on. if you externalize things, you've got this going on, right? And so this kind of creates a clamp on you. This is already in, so it's corrupting. You're getting corrupted from two ends, essentially. Seriously, the more you look into it, let's just focus on what we're talking about. So this is what's going on. Now, pertaining to the P.A.N.I.C model itself, which we're going to start with, we're going to start with the P, which we already established stands for polarization. So I'm just going to go a little. So we understand how these two create a clamp on you. Let's go over polarization. Nice, 10 minutes. Not bad. So we're going to start with polarization, which is what the P is for. So polarization operates on your environment, right? Mainly. And by the way, within the P.A.N.I.C model, as you move from left to right, it's going to go from operating on the environment to operating more and more on you, right? Just remember that, because it's very important. Starts at the environment, goes in, because it's advancing into trying to get internalized in you. That's what the I is for, actually. The E.Q.U.A.T model is the opposite. It works from the inside out. So, again, it's like a T moving in from the inside of your mind, from the inside of your psyche to the outside. So you're basically surrounded. So, let's focus on the polarization, which operates on your environment. We already established this is a gradient. So it goes gradually from one way to the other, and so on and so forth, maybe from both directions to the meeting at the center, so on and so forth. Polarization, what it does is it highlights 2 points of conflict. They might not be conflict, actually, just 2 points in general. The whole idea is to basically highlight 2 things that seem opposite to each other, or are opposite to each other. And speaking of actually polarization, we should probably get the types of polarization out of the way. And the types of polarization are condition polarization, opportunistic, I'm just going to write OPP here, and decoy. Condition polarization is polarizing pre-existing conditions that actually have elements that are contradictory to each other. And this is not to be mistaken for opportunistic. Opportunistic is something that might happen and then drop, but then they took the opportunity. This is very well documented in economics, like mainly in economic supremacy of the West and their hegemony. It was like a fluke after World War II. Hope 3 doesn't happen. At this point, we all know that it's not going to happen. So in World War II, after the whole ordeal, where countries were basically disheveled, they took the opportunity, which is opportunistic, and they took an opportunity of a naturally occurring deficit. So polarization, again, highlights 2 points, and then it might create like there's a deficit, either this way or that way. Just to give you a sense of that, these are the 2 competing things, and then this might go down and this might go up and all of that, right? And so this is the process of polarization, highlighting 2 ends and so on and so forth. And by the way, just to get this out of the way, a very important note is that each of these individually are not necessarily evil things, but it's the context at which they're utilized and how they're utilized and the intention that makes them that way. So polarization within itself, again, we said polarization already leverages a part of your nature, your fitra, to categorize, and this is done so that you can order your mind and order things and be able to interact with people better, not necessarily just to exploit and manipulate, but that's sadly its use here. So the condition is basically just a naturally occurring deficit between two things, let's say numbers, fire, water and fire, so on and so forth. Opportunistic is based on opportunity, something that just happened that created a polarization, created an up or down kind of pressure gauge difference. They will jump on that opportunity. And that's opportunistic. Decoy is basically there being only one entity, and then I want to polarize it. So what do? I give you the opposite of it. But it doesn't have an opposite. I just created an opposite, and I told you, oh, look at the opposite of this. Like a square is the opposite of the circle. Well, that's not really the case. They're both shapes, which we'll get to that. That's abstraction later. That I can tell you two things are opposing, and then when you question me, I'll make it very difficult for you to actually understand that those are just two shapes. I'll tell you the box is this element, this entity that contains you and limits your movement. It's a shape. A circle is a shape, So now that we've established polarization, it does not operate alone. Since things operate in gradients, right, the West benefits a lot from making sure that not only are you now polarized, so you see two opposing factors, right? Oh, and to get the examples out of the way, if we're talking psychological, it's very obvious. From the gender wars, male and female, men and women, so on and so forth, to actually gender, like within gender itself, when they tried to rewrite and confuse people, they polarized gender and sexuality as if they're two different things. You know what I mean? And so on and so forth. You can go with psychology, so many different examples. How the human being is perceived in Western science as this instinctive bestial, creature, and then that got civilized, as opposed to born and created dignified, and so on and so forth. That's psychological. Economical, we've already mentioned, for example, after World War II, and political, right wing, left wing, conservative, liberal, even though those two things serve the same purpose. And that's what they want you to forget. This can show you, when you start to look and study and perceive the world, you start to track down the gradient. You start to see, you might reach the conclusion, wait a minute, right wing and left wing are actually like each other. They both have the same goal. So what do? Take this whole thing right here and abstract it. Abstract it. Make it very difficult for you to study. Make it very difficult for you to understand these things. Whether by telling you these things are not useful, or it's too difficult for you to study, right? So on and so forth, different things. Abstraction can happen by distracting you, littering you with distractions, right? Video games, stories, books, you name it. And the video games and the stories don't pertain to reality. They don't show you the spectrum. They just reinforce the polar opposites. So this is abstraction. And that's pretty much it. You can't really make your way to the conclusion that, wait a minute, this is the same gradient. These are both within my environment. They're operating on the same, essentially, level, but you only see the part where they're different. And this is where the abstraction comes in. A good example of psychological abstraction would be Western psychology. They're so focused on the DSM and diagnosis, and giving you a diagnosis and giving you a label, right? Rather than actually figuring out what's going on step by step. Step by step would mean that you can actually reach the conclusion then start working on your problem. No, right? Here's your diagnosis, right? So the whole system is just abstracts your state. It doesn't actually tell you what's wrong with you. You go to a psychiatrist or a therapist, and well, those two things do slightly different things, but they either give you a medicine right away, right? Or they just write you like, you have BPD, you have NPD, you have HPD. Like, so that's all abstraction. And that's been psychological. If we're speaking economically, oh boy. Let's say we've already done the division of, let's say, supply versus demand. Those two things serve each other in the first place. Economy is just economy. But no, supply versus demand. Again, this competition, obsession with competition. And then the abstraction can happen in branding. Right. Why am I paying so much for this thing? What is it because supply and demand? Yeah, it is because supply and demand. Well, why? We all know it's the brand. Is there anything to the actual product than the brand? No. There's another company that sells the same thing, perhaps with better quality at a cheaper price, but you wouldn't know about it. Why? Because, oh look, the company with the brand, right? So this is another form of abstraction. Now that we've discussed that, political example. Entire politics is a big example of this. So, left wing and right wing, and then everything that's happening in between just gets filtered out. It just gets filtered out. Mainstream media, movies, you name it, they show you a particular side of the political spectrum while belittling the other or completely ignoring the other, so on and so forth. Well, now we have more light. So, we're going to move on to normalization. After your environment has been successfully polarized and abstracted, they're going to try and normalize this. So this is now the normal. Forget about the actual spectrum existing. That wasn't the thing. Actual reality with nuance. No. This is the normal. Now, there isn't much going on in the normalization phase. It's kind of a bridge between what has been established in your environment and making it internalized within your psyche, within your heart. And so all normalization aims to do is make you see it enough times through your input so that your process becomes, this is normal. Because throughout seeing it, you're going to be like, this is not normal. Your fitra, your nature is going to try to fight this back. It's going to tell you something is wrong here. This isn't normal. Normalization is all about making that not happen so you don't question it. So, God forbid you start to actually look into this without all the noise, and then you see, wait, these two things actually serve the same purpose, or you see nuanced, you see with a nuanced perspective. No. So normalization phase is all about propaganda. I mean, from start to finish, this is propaganda, but normalization in particular is now propaganda aimed at making you think this is okay, right? So think, for example, the Red Scare. The Red Scare. Every step applies. Polarization, right? Communism versus capitalism, even though both of these things are socioeconomic models. They have nothing to do with what's going on here, right? Abstraction. For example, if you've ever asked somebody who actually talks a lot about this, what's the difference between communism and socialism? They'll be like, there's a difference? This has happened to me before. I don't know if it's happened to other people, but yeah, this is abstraction. Because again, they want you to think red bad, communism bad, right? Not that communism is particularly good, but at the same time, again, it's all about polarization, because they want to show like they want to appear like they're on top. So someone has to be at the bottom, because they can't be naturally at the top. They don't have supremacy. And so this is where the normalization phase comes in. So a good example of this psychologically, actually pertaining to family and social life, would be the nuclear family. I can't type nuclear family. Nuclear family. I suppose you get the idea. That is psychological. Economically, normalization would be, it's now normal that just the dollar, everything has been dollarized. Well, not now in particular, but back then. It was just normal. Dollar, everything's with the dollar. Why? Because they're superior. You start to dig into it, all sorts of abstractions get in the way. So that's the normalization phase, psychologically, economically. We're missing something. Oh, my bad. Psychologically, politically as well. Normalization would be, once again, to normalize the model of right-wing, left-wing, liberal versus conservative. And you'd notice this specifically if you're in any countries that started to talk with the same values, even though like the values within themselves are straw, they are hollow, but this has just been standardized as the way to just look at everything, right? Another actually factor, or another example, for normalization would be GDP. It's normalizing how they want you to perceive what supremacy is, what is deemed superior or higher than, using a standard, right? But they make the standard, and so on and so forth. A voice crack there. So that's been normalization. Now, internalization, as we will understand later, is where we really start to kind of go from here to here, right? Where once again here it happens from the inside to the outside. So you start to view things with their ethics, for example. And so internalization happens here. Oh, apologize for that. Give me a second. And we're back. So the internalization phase is where once this is done enough and injected into every facet of your life, you start to basically internalize these values as being superior. This is the crux of Western hegemony. It's just purely based on this. It's all leading up to this stage of internalization. Once you've internalized that, the consensus that they are in fact superior, that's where they actually get their superiority from. Other than that, everything is empty. Everything is opportunistic polarization coupled with abstraction of the truth and normalization through propaganda and mediums. And so this stage right here is where the person has kind of been like sufficiently surrounded. And this is why this really does pertain to strategy, other than the fact that their strategy itself is based on panic, both figuratively and literally. Also, it's a matter of time of exposure with this model. So it just becomes a matter of time and enough exposure that will allow a person to internalize this. Of course, the person themselves need to have fortifications, and this is in the sense of studying, understanding, and so like anything that pertains to combat the tools. Ignorance, fear, pride, kind of stems from ignorance to a certain degree. Anything that combats that, humiliation, humility, so on and so forth, falls under that category. Which leads us to the final stage of the P.A.N.I.C model. Thank God we're kind of at 30 minutes here. Which is crystallization. This is simply the internalization having been reinforced enough in somebody to a point where their faith is affected and the state becomes crystallized. Forgot to have abstraction here. And of course, this is polarization. And so, crystallization is the final stage. This is where it becomes difficult to speak to people about the matter, about any subjects pertaining to Western straw hegemony, to their supremacy, trying to explain to somebody how this is all in their head, it's in our head, that we can fight back, that perhaps we need to start to develop new tools, new methods of interacting with the world that are not based on years of psychological operation. They will not be taking that in if they're in the crystallization phase. This is also in fiqh al-nafs, this would be a stage where the heart, the qalb, has really hardened, has grown callous from having internalized so much of this process, to the point where the person themselves, this also shows in the internalization phase, begins to see the world in this pattern, in the pattern of polarization, you versus me, him versus them, so on and so forth. In abstraction, any nuance, any details become unnecessary. They only focus on, for example, outcomes, goals. The journey is gone. There's no point of the journey as long as it doesn't lead to a goal, or as long as it doesn't lead to an end goal that they want. So on and so forth. This manifests in so many different ways that generally I cannot cover in one episode, especially the same episode I'm covering the model in, but you get the gist of it. And so this has been the P.A.N.I.C model and how it's manifested. Crystallization can also apply not just to individuals, but to systems. Systems that have internalized Western hegemony or Western straw hegemony as the superior standard. Again, think GDP, think other methods, economically, politically, psychologically. That's pretty much it. Even a person's own perception of oneself through Western psychology, it's very demeaning. But the person doesn't see it that way. They see that this is the superior way to look at myself, if they're in the crystallization phase, especially, or the internalization phase. So, this has been the P.A.N.I.C model, and we're going to explain more on the E.Q.U.A.T model next time, inshallah. I hope this is of value to everybody watching. Thank you very much for your attention. This has been Shingiro. I will see you